Today was the 9th and final round of the Norway Chess Tournament 2015. We were all set up for a grandstand finish. Vasilij Topalov led the tournament and just half a point behind Viswanathan Anand. They played in the final round. What would happen? Topalov, with the white pieces, played very solidly. Many of you might recognise this position. It's exactly the same as Ivanchuk against Carlsen from Vaikanze earlier this year. And here Topalov offered an exchange of bishops that was declined, and the players repeated moves. Well, I can understand why Topalov would be happy with a draw. Of course, that guarantees him first place on his own in the tournament. As for Anand, well, a lot of people were disappointed with him playing so solidly, but Anand is the great realist, the great pragmatist, and he just felt that a draw with the black pieces was fine, and his overall result in the tournament of 6 out of 9 was a good score, which it was indeed. So Topalov first with 6.5, Anand second with 6 out of 9. Let's go to something a little more interesting. Aronian against Nakamura. Now we join the game after 20 moves. Nakamura, sensing Aronian was not in good form, played a very sharp opening, and you can see he has this pawn lodged on h3. Now that's a beautiful position because it means that if white ever castles, then the king is going to be really vulnerable to a mating attack. Black's piece is also very active here. Understandably, Aronian played queen e2 to prevent black's queen coming into f3. If the queens are exchanged, then it's not so bad for white. But, well, Nakamura played a very nice move here, knight e5. So that knight obviously looking to come into d3 or possibly f3. Castling is a disaster. Check, and then rook d2 wins. So you can see both queen and bishop are attacked. Aronian exchanged on h5, but this was met by knight d3 check first. And Aronian simply played king e2 here. If he plays king f1, then rook takes h5. Now it's a very forcing sequence. The knight attacks rook and bishop. The rook must protect the bishop. And now comes bishop takes e3. Well, Aronian must have overlooked this. It basically wins a pawn for nothing. If it's taken, then check. If the king goes to e2, then rook f2 is fatal. If the king goes to g1, then rook d f6 forces a very quick decision. Mate is threatened. So after this, well, white can play on a pawn down, but it's not a pleasant position. So after knight d3 check, Aronian chose to play king e2. Nakamura took the rook with check and recaptured the queen. So Nakamura is a clear exchange up, and his technique was quite good enough to win this game. So that meant that Nakamura joined Anand on 6 out of 9. Now, all eyes were on the all-Norwegian clash between John Ludvig Hammer with the white pieces against Magnus Carlsen. Of course, there's a lot of pride at stake, although they're good friends and they work together on their chess. Hammer has been a second for Carlsen. Of course, there's still intense rivalry between these two players. So it's interesting to see how this one would play out. Carlsen played a6 here. It looks slightly odd, but actually not a bad move at all. Often you can get a transposition to a Queen's Gambit accepted in some variations where black takes on c4. It's almost like a waiting move. For example, after knight c3, you can take on c4 and hope to protect that pawn. Hammer played bishop g5. Not a bad move. Solid move. And now, well, a very standard way to play would be bishop e7, and after this exchange, well, you can recapture with queen or knight. This is fine for black. But clearly Magnus was in the mood for an uncompromising fight. Perhaps he felt that those early exchanges would just be a bit too dull, and he's desperate to play for a win, to try to prove himself. But I really dislike f6. The bishop dropped back to d2. This weakens e6, it weakens this diagonal, it weakens the king, even if it castles kingside. It's a chronic weakness. I don't like it at all. And it takes away the best square from the knight on f6 as well. I mean, maybe it's best here if black just plays solidly and, perhaps with bishop d6, knight d7, maybe even goes for some kind of stonewall position. But I certainly don't like pawn takes pawn in this position, which is what Carlsen played. And after e3, well, perhaps he dreamt of protecting this pawn with b5, but actually white is going to win this back very easily. For example, bishop b7, you exchange, and then play b3 and you get the pawn back. That's just one variation, but it's typical. So Carlsen was improvising from now on. Bishop takes c4. Well, you can see that, there is already some pressure on e6. Normally in this kind of Queen's Gambit position, you want to bring your bishop to the long diagonal, but that is very problematic with the weak pawn on e6. Now I think white could just play knight c3, castles, knight e4, rook c1. Pleasant advantage for white. Instead, after some thought, Hammer played e4. I'm not sure this is necessary, but it's not bad. Both sides castled, and now queen b3. So, immediate pressure on the e6 pawn. And now queen d7 looks normal. And perhaps, black can push the bishop away and play bishop to b7. It's perhaps not a bad way of playing. Although, obviously the queen looks very awkwardly placed on d7. Instead, Carlsen was creative again. He played king h8, allowing bishop e6. But actually he wins the pawn back like this. Obviously, knight takes bishop would allow knight takes d4. Not too clever. So after king takes, queen d6 check. King h1, you could play to g1, but Hammer was worried about some kind of eventual check on f3 with a black knight coming in. Okay, what's the idea? d5. White is not winning a piece here. After bishop g8, you can see there's a pin. So after that little flurry of exchanges, in fact material is still even, but white has very nice pawns here. And this is an excellent move. Queen a3, forcing an endgame. So black exchanged, white recapture with the knight. And now white gains time because obviously the pawn attacks the knight. And it's very awkward for black. If you come into the middle, then this would just be exchanged. That's dreadful with an isolated pawn that can be attacked so easily with bishop and knight, and there's pressure on this pawn as well. Very bad position. So Carlsen dropped the knight back to a7, but obviously not a beautiful square. Bishop b4 and rook c1, so pressure on c7. If c6, then that d pawn actually turns out to be very strong. So rook c8, not a very pleasant move to have to make. Knight d4. So the aim of this is to prevent black breaking with f5. And if white can secure this very nice pawn centre, then he just has a beautiful position, beautiful space advantage. Weakness on c7, black's pieces, or all of black's minor pieces, looking rather poorly placed. So Carlsen lashed out. He played f5. Now, if the knight is taken on e7, this doesn't actually win a pawn, because e4 is on prise. So very calmly, Hammer just played f3 to support the pawn on e4. There was an exchange and knight g6. Now it is possible to defend that pawn. I should say, by the way, that when f5 was played, Hammer thought this was a really bad move. He felt that this opened the diagonal and just left Black's king too precariously placed. His judgment, his assessment of the position actually proved correct. Sorry, let's just go forward again. So that's the position. As I said, rook e1 is possible, but Hammer went in straight away with knight f5. A lot of people, I was commentating live on this game, a lot of people were criticising this move, saying that perhaps blown White's advantage. In fact, I think it's a very good practical choice. Carlsen took on e4, he has to. And bishop c3, this is the idea. Checkmate in one move threatened. Carlsen takes the pawn on d5. Check. King g8. And now the bishop retreats, attacking the knight and threatening knight h6, checkmate. Magnus admitted to Hammer after the game that he actually overlooked this move, which shows that Magnus is kind of all over the place at the moment. It's a pretty obvious tactic. Well, to deal with these two threats, Black really has only one choice, and that's to give up the exchange. And at the moment it's one pawn, but after this it's two pawns. Two pawns for the exchange. Now, if Black had time to play, for example, the bishop back to d5 and to cement that with c6, I would say Black would be fine. But here, b3 creates real difficulties for Black. Obviously, that bishop is in danger of being trapped. That's one thing. But also, Black's pieces are just scattered to the four corners. Black's king is actually in some danger here. It's very exposed. All White's pieces look good. Okay, perhaps with the exception of the knight on a3, but that can join in the battle fairly easily. If you look at what the computers say in the position, they all think that c5 is a good move for Black, with this continuation in mind. Obviously, if the knight moves, then bishop takes b3. Rook f2, this is a forcing sequence. Exchange of rooks. And rook takes a2. So, further simplification, Black still has two pawns and a knight for the rook. And computers think this is slightly better for White. I tell you, this is so easy to get wrong for Black. If this pawn drops, for example, then I would imagine White would be winning. If this rook manages to enter into the position and take a pawn there, also winning for White. Very difficult to defend, and I think this was really what Hammer had been expecting. Instead, Carlsen played rook d8, but that's much, much worse. c5 was definitely the best defence. Rook d8 is much worse because now Black's king is in massive trouble. Rook c3, good move. Could take on c7, but rook c3 is far better. Protecting this pawn means the bishop is still in trouble. The bishop can't aid Black's defence. Knight f4. Rook f6 is apparently a slightly quicker move. Knight f4, a really good practical move from Hammer. I really like this move. Basically, exchanging knights will expose Black's king to attack even more because it just removes a defender. Knight f4 is a very good practical move. The exchange, and now rook c7, and Black is utterly lost here. Look at these pieces, just all over the place. And rook b3 is the final mistake. Rook d1 threatens mate. Knight c6, and now rook d7 threat rook c8, and there's no decent defence to that. I think a really good game by John Ludwig Hammer. So he brings his score up to 3 out of 9. Well, considering his rating, actually, I'd say that's a par score, not a bad score. Carlsen finishes on 3.5 out of 9. A disaster for him. I mean, that is actually the first total disaster that I can remember from him. I've never known him play tournament as bad as that. Dreadful score. We can't forget what happened to him in round 1 against Topalov, where he lost on time unnecessarily, and clearly that has affected his whole tournament. Moreover, he finds it very difficult to play in front of his home crowd. Never played a really good tournament in Norway. That's also something to bear in mind, but also something that he can improve on in the future. So, congratulations to Vasilij Topalov, the winner of the tournament, and the next tournament in the Grand Chess Tour will be St. Louis in September.